Tonight we're going to explore a question that on the surface seems very simple, but I know as a young person, formerly, it was something that did confuse me a little bit because I could never understand why Jesus constantly irritated the rulers of the day by healing on the Sabbath day. And when we read through the records of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, one thing becomes very clear and apparent, that these events are not accidental. Christ Jesus repeatedly heals and chooses the Sabbath day to perform miracles and healing. And every time he does it, he creates tension, he draws criticism, he upsets people, and he angers the rulers and the religious leaders at the time, because it was in direct opposition to the traditions and the laws that they were enforcing and upholding. So the question then arises, if Christ preaches that we should be peaceable to all mankind, why did he cause this upset intentionally? Was Christ breaking the law by doing this? Was he deliberately provoking conflict? Or was there something deeper going on? And of course we know that Christ was a man without sin. He was the Son of God, and therefore he wasn't breaking the law, he wasn't breaking the Sabbath. So this evening we'll explore how he was doing this to redirect the people to the original and the true meaning of the Sabbath and the law. So in order to understand that, we need to look at the origin of the Sabbath day. And I want you to turn up to Genesis chapter 1, because we'll find the origins of the Sabbath day right back in creation. I'm sure you all know where we're going. So right back at creation, and we're going to go to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 31. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all the work which God created and made. All right. So we see in chapter 2 and verse 2 that God rested. And it's interesting to know that the word Sabbath, or Shabbat, which is how the Jews pronounce it, it means to cease, to take an intermission or rest, which is what God is doing here in Genesis chapter 2, verse 2. Now, the rest that God took doesn't mean that he was tired, rather that he ceased from the work, his creative work, and he looked back at what he did and he saw that it was good, it was complete. And this is a significant event, and it says as such that he sanctified it. Okay, he appointed it to be a special and holy day. So we find right from the beginning, from the first chapter of the Bible, the first and second chapter of the Bible, the principle behind the Sabbath day was all about completion, peace, satisfaction, and enjoyment in what had been accomplished. That was God's original intention with the Sabbath day. Now we come across the Exodus and chapter 20. So in Exodus chapter 20, we're now into the deliverance of the law of Moses. Of course, Exodus 20 is the Ten Commandments. And in Exodus chapter 20, there's the idea of the Sabbath is now consecrated into the law. All right, we're going to read verse 9 through to verse 11. We'll start in verse 8. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy." Okay, so that was the commandment that God made, or that was established in Genesis chapter 2. 6 days shalt thou labour and do thy work, but on the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt do no work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that was within thy gates. Why? Because in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Okay? So, the Sabbath day is all about remembering the creative work of God. Okay? Just as God created and worked for 6 days and then rested the seventh, so the children of Israel were also commanded to do the same. And you see the word here, it says to be hallowed. It's the exact same word as sanctified in Genesis chapter 2. It just means that it was to be observed. Okay? It was something that they had to follow. And this specifically emphasizes that the children of Israel were to do no work. Okay? That was the command, to do no work. Not them, not their sons, not their daughters. They couldn't, sneak the servants out to go and do it while they weren't doing it. Not the cattle, not even the visitors who were with them in their house. Why? Because God had blessed it and made it holy. Back in Genesis chapter 2. Now, the word for work here implies things that come about from your general occupation or your general employment. It's very specific about what you do each week. It's like us. We work a job during the week, and generally we have the weekends off, and we rest from that work. Okay, very similar concept. We come then across the Deuteronomy. So come across another few more books. We're going to go to Deuteronomy chapter 5. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, we find that there's going to be a little bit more built on to this idea of the Sabbath day. We're going to read from verse 12. Keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it, as Yahweh thy God hath commanded thee. 6 days shall they labour to do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt do no work. Right? And that's the same, which is what we read in Exodus. But then we come up to verse 15. And he says, And remember that thou was a servant in the land of Egypt, that Yahweh thy God brought thee out thence through a mighty hand and by a stretched out arm. Therefore Yahweh thy God commandeth thee to keep the Sabbath day. So we find then the Sabbath day also encompasses deliverance and freedom and mercy. Okay? And there's a key word that if you wanted to highlight it in this verse, it says 6 days shall they labour and do thy work. Okay? It's very specific that the rest was from their work. Okay? It was the work of men that was to be rested from. Why? So they could think about the work that God did with them in delivering them from Egypt. Okay? So what is the meaning of the Sabbath? Well, the Sabbath wasn't just about stopping work. It was about rest, yes, but it was also about remembrance and restoration. It was about remembering God and the work that God had done with them. No different to the way we come to the meeting each Sunday to refresh our minds around the Word of God, to remember the work of our Lord Jesus Christ. The people were to use the Sabbath to reflect upon the blessings that they had been given, not only individually, but collectively as a nation and as a people who loved God. However, when we come to the time of Christ, the spirit of this day had been changed by rules and traditions of men. But it's important for us to understand why the Sabbath was so important then to the Jews. And the Sabbath day actually became central to Jewish life. In Exodus chapter 31, don't have to turn this one up, it's up on the slide, it says, Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, Verily my Sabbaths ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that ye may know that I am Yahweh, that doth sanctify you. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations, for a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. And this chapter goes on to explain more things about the Sabbath, even to say that if they didn't keep the Sabbath, they could be punished in ways like being put to death. So the Sabbath was very significant for the Jews because it marked them as God's people. Every week, the Sabbath reminded them that God was their creator, that God was their deliverer. And because of this, they belonged to him and they were God's special chosen people. And because this became so significant to them as a culture, it was taken very, very seriously. And by the time we come to the first century, the Jews had a very deep respect for the Sabbath day. But there's a big problem with that, and that is when something becomes very highly valued and very fundamental to your identity and your culture, then it can also become distorted when people's personal views and their personal preferences start to influence it. And that's how we find it at the time of Christ. So what went wrong? Well, the Sabbath became surrounded by human tradition. We find that additional rules were added by rabbinic sages and leaders in the land. And these were not found in the Bible, and they were quite often only an oral tradition. Okay, so it was something that people spoke. And what happens when people speak things over time? Right, they get changed. Okay. They even took the category of work, which we saw was a very simple translation, and they identified it into 39 different categories of work. And then beyond this 39, then they had thousands of other derived activities which became forbidden because they shared similar characteristics. And for a modern application, even today, they include things like turning on and off electrical switches, okay? How far you're allowed to drive on a Sabbath day, how many plants in your house you're allowed to water, and even how many pieces of toilet paper you're allowed to tear off when you go to the bathroom. So you can see over time the focus of the Sabbath day shifted. Instead of asking, how can we honour God and think about God through this day, they began focusing on how can we avoid breaking the rules. Or more specifically, the rulers in the land, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, how can we, as these great law-abiding people, ensure that these common people who don't understand the law as much can't pollute this holy day? We must keep it, uphold it, and keep it pure. And that's a very different mindset to what God intended the day to be right from the beginning. The Sabbath was meant to be a blessing, a relief, a gift, but it had become a burden, a restriction, and a system of control. And they fenced around the law, if you like, with all these extra rules to create this control. And this is the environment that Christ came in to fix. So just as an example, this is how the law of Moses was meant to be, right? So it was meant to be accessible to the people. And the Levites and the priests were meant to be there to teach and to guide the children of Israel. And they were meant to learn of the promises and the blessings that God had given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the problem with responsibility is that without check, human nature will inevitably corrupt power for their own means and for their own purpose. And this is how we find the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the scribes, and the leaders in the land at this time, as they became more and more self-absorbed in their own positions and their own responsibilities, rather than leading the people closer to God. We talked about fencing around the law of Moses, and this is really what had happened, okay? That they'd created all these boundaries around the law. What you can and cannot carry, how far you're allowed to walk. They had detailed regulations on daily life, man-made rules about work, and of course their oral traditions, so they were easily added to and changed. And Christ tells them in Mark 7 verse 13 that through their traditions they made the work of God of none effect. They protected the law, but they added in their own rules and traditions. Come across to Matthew chapter 23. We'll have a look at how Christ described this time. Matthew 23, and reading from verse 1. Then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore, whatsoever they bid you, observe, that observe and do. But do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. They love the uppermost rooms at feasts, and the chief seats at synagogues, and the greetings in the marketplace, to be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi. So when we come to the question about why did Jesus heal on the Sabbath, we have to look at the overall problem, and this is the problem that Jesus was trying to correct, by showing the people that they could freely access God and his word through their faith and their belief. So when we come to Christ at the Sabbath day, there's three examples I want to consider. So first one, we're going to start from the end record. We're going to start at John, and John chapter 5 and verse 5. So come across to John 5. I'm just going to look at three examples of Christ healing on the Sabbath day, just quickly. And then we'll use these three examples to show why Christ did it. So John 5, reading from verse 5 through to verse 10. And a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. Jesus saw him lie, which knew that he had been now a long time in that case. And he said unto him, Wilt thou be made whole? And the impotent man answered him and said, Sir, I have no man, when the water is troubled, to put me into the pool. And while I am in coming, another steppeth down before me. And Jesus said unto him, Rise, take up thy bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. And the Jews therefore said unto him that was cured, It is the Sabbath day. It is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. Okay, so our first example is this man, the pool of Bethesda. Jesus simply says, Take up thy bed and walk. And how did the Jews respond? They said, It is the Sabbath day. It is not lawful for thee to carry thy bed. Let's come back to record of Luke chapter 13. We'll have a look at another example. Luke chapter 13 and verse 10. And he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And behold, there was a woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was bowed together, and she could in no wise lift herself up. And when Jesus saw her, he called to him, and said unto her, Woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmities. And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight, and glorified God. And the ruler of the synagogue answered with indignation, because that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath day, and said unto the people, There are 6 days in which men ought to work. In them therefore come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. Now, when we read the records from Exodus and Deuteronomy, did we ever read that there's 6 days to be healed, come in them to be... No, we didn't, did we? Because that's an oral tradition, okay? So how did they respond? Well, the woman was bent over for 18 years, okay? Imagine having been bent over and stuck, your back, having a bad back for 18 years. Some of you might have had a bad back for 18 years. And Jesus simply says to her, Woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmities. And how did the Jews respond? They said, Well, there are 6 days in which men ought to work. In them therefore come and be healed, not on the Sabbath. All right, one more, Mark chapter 3. Mark chapter 3. Of course, we read this tonight. And verse 1. And he entered again into the synagogue, and there was a man which had a withered hand. And they watched him whether he would heal on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. And he said unto the man which had the withered hand, Stand forth. And he said unto them, okay, this is Christ now questioning the rulers, Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days, or to do evil? To save life, or to kill? But they held their peace. And when he had looked round about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he said unto the man, Stretch forth thine hand. And he stretched it out, and it was restored whole as the other. Okay? So the man with the withered hand, stretch forth thy hand. And how was the response from the Pharisees? Well, they went forth and took counsel how they might destroy him. So we see each one of those times, the reaction is the same. It's met with criticism, it's met with anger, accusation that this is not lawful. So why does Christ keep doing it? He does it for 4 different reasons. 1, to show that it is lawful. 2, to expose wrong thinking. 3, to demonstrate mercy. And 4, to declare his authority. So we're going to now spend a little bit of time exploring those points a little bit deeper. Reason number 1, he did it to show that it was lawful. Come back with me to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew chapter 12, we find a very powerful statement from Christ. Reading from verse 11, he said unto them, What man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath day. He says it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath day. And that's a key phrase, because the leaders had reduced the Sabbath to what was allowed and what was not allowed. And this wasn't a faith-based approach at all. It was a legalistic view of God's commandments. But Christ reframed it into what was right to do, showing that man must be able to show forth faith and belief in God by his laws outworking in their actions. And in doing this, he showed that doing good is lawful. Showing mercy is lawful, and helping others is fulfilling the law. In other words, Christ is saying that the Sabbath was never meant to prevent kindness. It was not a day for restriction, but for restoration, and a day to do the works of God. And how could an act of healing, like what Christ did, do anything other than show forth the love of God that he showed to his people? Doing the work of God was a fulfillment of the law. And Christ therefore didn't break the Sabbath, but he revealed to the people that its true purpose was to do the work of God. And by doing this, he pushed through all the walls and traditions that had been set up in addition to God's truth. So reason number 2, he did it to expose wrong thinking. You know, Jesus quite often points out inconsistencies. In that record we just read in Matthew chapter 12 and in verse 11, he said to them, If you have one sheep and it fell into a pit on the Sabbath day, would you not lift it out? And of course they would. It's a rhetorical question. Okay, that's the way he says it. There's no answer to it. And by doing this, Jesus highlights the contradiction and hypocrisy of what they said. You see, they were willing to help an animal that had fallen into a pit, but they objected to him helping and healing a person. And this reveals something quite deeper. You see, their priorities were completely wrong. While they were technically correct in their rules according to the law and according to their traditions, spiritually they were completely out of alignment with God. And Jesus exposes this, not through just words, but by his actions and by what he did. And the leaders and those who loved the preeminence and the wonder of the people, well, they didn't like that at all, did they? All right, reason number 3. Christ did this to demonstrate mercy. You see, every time Christ performs a healing, it's an act of compassion. Think about the people he healed that we read about. The man at the pool of Bethesda had been there for 38 years. The woman who was bound and crippled who was bent over for 18 years. And the man with the withered hand, well, who knows how long, he may have been born like that. And all these people had become crippled by their conditions, making it impossible to do everyday tasks, it would have been almost impossible even for them to come and make a sacrifice and to worship at the temple. You see, these weren't just minor inconveniences. They didn't just require a band-aid or a kind word, right? These were lives that had become restricted. They were horrible burdens, and there was no escape from them. And they had suffered for decades. And what does Christ do? Well, he restores, he lifts, he frees, he heals with just the touch or just a word. And that perfectly aligns with the original purpose of the Sabbath, doesn't it? Remember back in Deuteronomy, God commanded them to remember the Sabbath. Why? Because you were slaves in Egypt and God delivered you. And what's Christ doing? Well, he's bringing deliverance to these people who are suffering on the Sabbath day. He's not breaking the Sabbath day. He's fulfilling its meaning and its true purpose to show forth the same love one towards another that God had shown to them as a nation in their suffering as slaves in Egypt. You know, Samuel says to Saul, just referencing back into the Kings, to obey is better than sacrifice, and Christ is showing forth this same idea, isn't he? That God desires mercy above sacrifice, that the spirit of the Sabbath was more important than the specific letter of the law. One more reason. Reason number 4, Christ did it to declare his authority. In Luke chapter 6 that we read tonight, verse 5, Christ also says this. He says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And that's a pretty remarkable claim, isn't it? And Christ, when he says this, he's saying to the Pharisees and the rulers, he says, I understand the Sabbath better than you do. And he's saying that to the people who were considered to be the most learned of the topic. He says, I have authority over it. And as the Son of the Most High, he had the authority to interpret and to apply the law perfectly and completely. And it's more than that, though, isn't it? Christ was the one that the Sabbath ultimately pointed towards. How? Because the Sabbath represents rest and completion and peace. And who brings all those things to us? Well, Jesus Christ did in his sacrifice by opening the way to access this rest unto all mankind and to us. But what does he mean then when he says that he comes to fulfill the law and to fulfill the Sabbath? Matthew chapter 5, he said, I am not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill. And that includes the law of the Sabbath. Now, this is important because it means that it doesn't replace or to cancel or to ignore. It means to complete its meaning. When Jesus heals on the Sabbath day, therefore, he's not rejecting the law, he's revealing its intention. The law said rest, but Jesus shows what this rest truly looks like through his words and through his miracles and by his own example. He showed forth the true meaning of the law, and he fulfilled it with what he spoke and how he acted. When we look at the bigger picture of the Sabbath, we also find that it points forward. You see, the Sabbath points forward to a bigger picture for all of us. It's designed to reveal something greater, and it's designed to reveal a future time when there will be no suffering in the world and where we are able to rest. It's not just about one day in the week, it's about something greater. Remember its roots. When God looked at creation and said it was good. It points forward, therefore, to a time when creation will be restored and when the Sabbath will be restored to the way that God originally intended. A future time when suffering will end, when burdens will be lifted, a time when God's people will enjoy a full and everlasting rest, and when we will find peace and prosperity in the earth. And Christ's miracles pointed forward to this time. Every miracle that Christ performed was a glimpse into the future. And when he heals on the Sabbath, he's saying, this is what the rest of God looks like. Okay? It's lifting the burdens of those who are suffering. And this is what's coming for all. So back to our original question, why did Jesus heal on the Sabbath day? Well, it wasn't to break the law and to provoke the rulers, even though it did. It was to correct misunderstanding. It was to restore God's intention with the Sabbath day. It was to demonstrate mercy that had been lacking under the rulership of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes. It was to reveal his God-given authority, and it was to point forward to the kingdom of God. And this is probably the most important part for us, because today we don't keep the Sabbath in the same day, do we? But the principle still matters, and within this there's a warning for all of us. Because if we today focus on rules and focus on structure, focus on everything being technically right and correct and making sure we do the right thing and, put the tablecloth on in the right way, if we take a legalistic view of the scriptures and the words of Christ, then we take the focus away from where it's meant to be. And while we do that, we miss the spirit and we miss the motive, don't we? Do we ever turn God's ways and commandments into burdens instead of blessings? Do we ever lose sight of the compassion and love that is intended in the words of Christ? Because if we do, well, then we can end up in the same position as those leaders in the time of Christ, and we have to be very careful not to fall short in that way. So as we close, as we conclude, let us remember the simple contrasts from the story. You see, the Jews saw rules and regulations as a way of controlling those who are lesser to themselves, whereas Christ, on the other hand, came and showed mercy, he teaching the people about the forgiveness that was open to all those who could approach unto God through him. The leaders and the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees had created burdens that were heavy to be borne and put them on the common people's shoulders. But Jesus revealed that blessings were able to be obtained through faith, removing this burden. The rulers saw the Sabbath as a way of restricting what the people could do, while Jesus showed that it was actually all about restoration, showing the true purpose of the law. And finally, the leaders had created a culture of separation in Israel. They'd almost created a class system, if you like, that those who most needed the mercy of God were unable to freely receive it. But Christ once again showed that they were all meant to be united together, Jews and Gentiles alike, in their faith and their love to God, walking together towards the kingdom of God. You see, Jesus did not break the Sabbath day. He showed that it was meant to be a day and a principle centered on restoring people back to God, not separation because of uncleanness or unnecessary rules. So how can we use the principles of the Sabbath day today ourselves? Well, we can set time apart each week dedicated for God, to read his Bible, to worship, to prayer, and to reflect upon it. We can prioritise rest and renewal. We can rest from our worldly busyness and seek emotional and spiritual renewal. And we can show compassion and mercy just like Christ did. And we can use this to extend kindness and compassion to others.